Two and a Half Admins, episode 177. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. What comes after open source? Bruce Perrins is working on it. This is an interview with the Register that has been doing the rounds lately. And I went into it thinking, oh, right, we're going to have a real solid plan here. And I came out a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, I came out very disappointed. I was super excited by the headline. Got about halfway through the article, was like, okay, great. So his whole plan is basically everybody needs to suck less and he hasn't worked out how yet. And then I read the rest of the article and that kind of confirmed the conclusion.
Some of it worried me a little bit as well. Like, I don't disagree with some of his points, especially, the pull quote they have here. I feel that IBM has gotten everything it wants from the open source developer community now and received something of a middle finger from them.
Which is absolutely true, but it just, I didn't see anything in that whole article that felt like a justification for this idea of, oh, we have to have post-open source that's separate from open source and shouldn't be confused with open source, which, like, he was very careful to make sure that we understood that his idea of post-open source should never be confused with open source. And I don't know, man. I'm more than open to the idea that there are better concepts in terms of licensing, that there are ways that we can improve the way that we regulate how our code is distributed and what rights people have. We can close loopholes that exploitive companies use. But I just didn't see anything there that felt like post open source.
I think mostly his idea is transitioning away from licensing code to basically having a contract rather than a license, which in the end, the license is a contract, so it's
precisely
maybe a dubious distinction, but
it's like saying, I want no part of paper. I prefer wood pulp that's been, processed and bleached and flattened into sheets.
Yeah, and we kind of have a post-open source situation now with source available licenses where you can study that code, you can audit it, but there are just some restrictions that don't pass the OSI definition. So it's not technically open source, but for all intents and purposes, it basically is.
I don't know that I would say that it basically is. Then that's, I think, one of the biggest problems is that we've seen this kind of dilution of open source to include things where it's like, oh, it's open source, but you can't do anything with it unless we like that.
Well, you can't host it yourself and be Amazon, basically, and just, make money off our shit without contributing back. That's what that's all about.
That's what the AGPL was already for. Like all this Johnny-come-lately stuff, like, the business license and the, common clause and all this stuff. It all strikes me as, just trying to drive a wedge in and, nerf open source more than really evolve it in a direction that's good for anybody but somebody trying to make money off of it.
But I would rather it be source available than proprietary, like closed source.
Sure, but what's the difference between source available, proprietary, and one of these business licenses that's like, yeah, you can look at the source, but we're the only ones that can make money off of it? If you pay Microsoft enough money and sign enough NDAs, they'll give you the source for Windows, but that doesn't make it open source.
Technically, you don't need any new license to make something source available but not free to use. Copyright already does that. You can give somebody a copy of the source code and they still don't get to actually compile it and use it just because they can see it, because you hold the copyright.
I suppose some of those big PHP things like vBulletin, for example, where the source code is effectively available to everyone, but it is still proprietary.
Precisely, and it goes back further than that. Before PHP hit, that's the way almost all web code worked. Back when everything was, Perl and CGI bin, it was very easy to get access to read, what code was in there. Then it started getting locked down a little bit. It started to be harder to get at the code, but PHP opened it back up. Because now if you're running PHP via a CGI gateway, as though it were old school Perl web code, then sure, you can obfuscate all of it. But if you're running PHP the way that PHP supposedly was going to revolutionize the web into, where you're just interspersing PHP in with the HTML, you start kind of opening things up. But yeah, ultimately, it does come down to exactly that. Just because you can see the code doesn't mean you're allowed to run it if it's got a proprietary I don't even want to say proprietary license, just copyright it. You don't have to do anything different. If it is copyrighted, it doesn't matter if somebody can see it. They can't copy it. They can't do anything else with it. It's still yours.
Well, his other big quote here is, our licenses aren't working anymore. We've had enough time that businesses have found all the loopholes, and thus we need something new. The GPL is not acting the way the GPL should have done when 1/3 of all paid-for Linux systems are sold with GPL circumvention clauses. It depends. Not all licenses aren't working how they were meant to.
Oh, here it comes from the FreeBSD guy. Buckle down, listeners.
The Apache license, the MIT license, lots of other licenses. But I agree that especially this stuff we've been seeing, like the business source license and the common clause, is showing that there's something wrong. And just in general, we've seen the way open source software is maintained and funded is just not the way it used to be, right? There's not a bunch of smaller companies contributing and people individually contributing and that being enough to sustain an open source project. Now, most of the people working seriously on open source stuff are paid to do so by an employer, not a bunch of hackers working in their computer lab by themselves, kind of on their own.
But then isn't your company, Clara, a sort of shining example of how it should work? People pay you to add features to FreeBSD and ZFS.
And make it the open source, yeah.
Yeah, and you upstream everything, right?
Yes, that is the way that it's supposed to work. I just don't think that you can accomplish that with a license. I think that is accomplished by having people with the will to do things fairly and in an open source fashion. And you can't expect a standard corporation to do that. That's not how they work. That's not what they're there for. You may think that a corporation like, let's say, Nike exists to make shoes. It does not. It exists to make money. If shoes happen to be making money, that's fine. But the only true legal fiduciary responsibility of that company is to generate returns for the shareholders. So anything that gets in the way of that, there's a constant pressure to erode it, to get rid of it, to wear it down, to punch holes in it. And that's exactly what we're seeing, and it's exactly what we're going to continue to see. Oh boy, it's my turn for the anti-capitalist rant this time. But seriously, as long as we literally have legal structures that say you can be sued if you fail to make as much profit as you could have because you owe it to your shareholders, yeah, you can't expect that same entity to go and do good things because it's better for the product and for their customers than for the bottom line. Even if they're motivated to, you can literally be sued for that if you're a public corporation that's issued stock.
But to go back to the shining example of Alan's company, you open source things because it's better for you as well as everyone else, right?
Right. Even coming back to Jim's Nike example, if you can show Nike that using open source will help them make better shoes for less money, and that in order to keep using that open source, they need to help sustain it by either contributing back or funding development or whatever, then suddenly it is within that fiduciary duty of Nike to contribute to open source.
Gentle listeners, what Alan is describing here is what's known as the attract phase. Once the attract phase ends, the extract phase begins.
When are you going to start extracting with your company, Alan?
No. This is not about Clara. Alan was talking about my Nike example. And if you can prove that, doing the right thing makes Nike more money, then it becomes Nike's fiduciary duty to do the right thing. But, the problem just becomes, again, that, we see this play out over and over and over. Yeah, corporations will absolutely do very consumer-friendly things. That's the attract phase. That's what gets all the people in. And once all the people are in, now it's time for the extract phase, where you get absolutely the most possible out of them. In a lot of cases, you literally kill the company doing so, but you don't care because you are the venture capitalist that funded the damn thing to begin with. And once you get all that extraction out, you're ready to dump that as capital into your next venture, which first attracts and then completely screws over all its customers. I don't know how we get rid of that as long as we maintain the type of legal corporate structures that we have right now. We have very much built into law a constant pressure and even responsibility to make as much money as possible. And a private company can resist that. And private companies frequently do. Public companies really can't, because even if that public company is just absolutely packed chock full of people who care, they have to answer to the bean counters that don't.
Why does everything always come down to capitalism when there's a problem?
Well, I think here, I would say it's even more the other direction.
Because capitalism is all we have. So we hit its problems constantly. Now, this is one thing I do want to get clear, because I've been going on a lot of this, some joking about Alan saying something, some me, whatever else. Anti-capitalist. Don't get it twisted. Capitalism is actually the closest thing to a solo working ideology that we have right now. The problem is that it is only the closest thing. There is no such thing as a single ideology that actually works well under all circumstances. You have to tune your algorithms to match, the stream of inputs and outputs to get them to do what you want, right? And any self-contained ideology has glaring weaknesses to be exploited. So if you want a truly functional society, you can start out with a particular ideology, but you've got to be willing to patch the actual system to respond to the attempts to exploit it. And when you do so, you will open up new loopholes, and the bad actors will try to exploit those, and then you have to patch them. You're never done. It's a constant evolution. And anytime you get somebody saying, this is it, we have it solved, we don't have to do anything else, we have the static, perfect structure, well, you can expect that to get toppled next week.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think part of the problem we see in open source here is also the same thing we've seen with the rest of the internet, is just this concentration in a couple of big entities, versus when open source current model worked so well, it was because it was highly distributed, right? There were lots of different companies and universities and different people contributing to open source. And now, you have individual contributors and people that work for a couple of big companies is the mainstay of where the development comes from. And that concentration, I think, is part of why we see the problem, because, as the economy goes through its cycles and so on, that ebbs and flows in ways that are much less resilient than when it was a much broader base of support in the 90s and 2000s and so on, the earlier days of open source.
Essentially, I think this boils down to Bruce is trying to solve a legal problem and a societal problem with software licensing, and I just don't think that's going to do the trick,
Yeah, and I think having more and more restrictive licenses is just going to lead to people finding more loopholes, not to an open source utopia.
Things have to change. It's like InfoSec. We've all come to understand at this point, some of us very grudgingly, but I think we've all eventually gotten there, the idea that software is never complete. There are always patches that need doing. You have to change to things as they evolve. The operating system changes out from beneath you. The hardware changes out from beneath the operating system. Underneath that, people find loopholes that you didn't know about. They exploit things, that you hadn't thought of. And it's a constant dance. You're never entirely done. And if we've come to understand that's true of software, I'm not sure why so many of us have so much trouble believing that about political and financial systems that are vastly more complex and under attack from, frankly, vastly more actors than any computer code.
I think the biggest thing for licensing is that you're not going to get everybody who wrote code under V2 of a license to agree to the terms of V3 of a license.
Don't have any particular license in mind there, do you, Alan?
What if you've got a contributor license agreement, eh?
I think the bigger example was OpenSSL when they tried to switch from their kind of funky license to something more standard, trying to contact every person who had ever committed code to OpenSSL, including under pseudonyms and not real names, and try to correlate, did this person actually say it was okay for us to relicense their code or not?
Yeah, that's why you need an or later in your license.
It does happen sometimes. It's very difficult, but I can think of one example where I have seen exactly that happen. It's a bit controversial, and I've gotten yelled at by a lot of people about it, but the Muse Group, when they changed the license on, I don't think that was on Audacity. I think they changed the license on MuseScore, and they did not have a CLA in place. And yeah, they had to secure, the permission of all involved. But the mitigating factor there was, I want to say that they got permission from almost everybody that they needed to, and then they just rewrote the rest of it. But the big mitigating factor was that they had a guy on staff who had contributed something like 60% of the current code base over the years, and they had hired this guy. So like all of his stuff, of course, good to go. And also you have the guy who is so familiar with that code base that, he's authored like 60% of the current version of it on tap to just go ahead and say, oh, okay, so, these few like drive-by patches from random people that we couldn't find, well, screw it. We just re-implement those and we're good to go. So yeah, it can be done, but a lot of that depends on, the ratios of your community contributions versus, what you have more control of in-house. It's not an easy thing thinking through these issues when you're first creating an open source project. I spent more time than I even want to admit waffling between GPL v2 and GPL v3 before beginning to develop Sanoid. And I ended up on GPL v3 because I was like, well, this will be fine for me. And I really did not want to do the weird like GPL v2 or GPL v3 thing. I don't like these licenses that it's like, oh, it's this version now, but it can be whatever it wants to be like further down the road. I'm like, nah, I want to go ahead and lock in my GPL v3 protections for, all my users.
Yeah, so Bruce's ideas are a little out there. His idea of post-open, he said, is a bit more involved than open source. It would define the corporate relationship with developers to ensure companies paid a fair amount for the benefits they receive. He imagines a simple yearly compliance process that gets companies all the rights they need to use post-open software, and they'd fund developers who would be encouraged to write software that's usable by the common person as opposed to technical experts. And it seems he's trying to push a lot more.
I just realized he's reinventing fair trade coffee is what he's doing.
Well, and then he goes on to talking about, how with Google and some other companies like Facebook that the consumer is actually the product and so on. It's like, I don't know if you're going to solve that with a license. Sorry, dude.
Yeah. Cannot.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. Want to be prepared for any shitstorm that may hit your desk during the workday? Check out the brand new Autonomous IT podcast. Listen in as a variety of experts in the IT operations space discuss the latest Patch Tuesday releases, mitigation tips, and custom automations to help with CVE remediations. Make new work friends. Listen now to the Autonomous IT podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's the Autonomous IT podcast. A tale of two casino ransomware attacks. One paid out, one did not. This is a piece on the Register about MGM and Caesars and their various responses to ransomware attacks. And it's quite a depressing conclusion that it's probably better to pay the ransomware. I cannot believe that that is true.
It was a bullshit conclusion, and that, if nothing else, illustrates just how far the Register has fallen. That it came to the conclusion that it's probably a good idea to pay the freaking Dane Guild. No! You never pay the Dane Guild unless you just want to make sure you see the Dane again next year. And maybe next week,
And it doesn't even guarantee that you're going to get your data back or not leaked or whatever. Like, these are criminals, man. You can't trust them to actually give you the key once you paid them the $10 million or whatever.
Yeah, it's like the earlier days of spam when almost no unsubscribe link was legit and all any of them ever did was just confirm, yep, we got a live one here. So, it's, don't unsubscribe, don't unsubscribe, don't unsubscribe. And now we have a little bit better policed system for that. And, okay, if this is a reputable vendor, it probably actually is a good idea to click unsubscribe. If it's something really sketchy, then I don't click the unsubscribe link. Well, there is no, it's not sketchy when you're talking about paying a ransomware gang. You're doing two things when you pay the ransomware gang. You're funding further attacks, and you're also telling them you will give them money if they fuck with you. That might buy you some time on this particular incident. The odds are fairly good that if they haven't already leaked your data because it was tasty for some reason onto some private forum, the odds are honestly fairly good that they'll at least be less aggressive about trying to dump it and make sure everybody notices if, you throw all the money at them that they're asking for. But that's then. You don't get to sign a legally binding contract with them about how long it takes before they're right back in your system screwing you over again.
Yeah, or just being like, oh, it turns out we didn't delete the data and we'd like some more money. Otherwise, we'll leak the data.
Yep.
But what about this idea of criminalizing paying ransoms?
Should have been done years ago. It absolutely should be illegal, in my opinion. It should not be legal for a private entity or business to pay off any kind of a criminal ransom, whether it's, somebody kidnapped your kid. Now, if the FBI decides the best way to get your kid back is to involve paying these people money and maybe you eventually get them later, but that's a decision for government. You shouldn't have the option of handing criminals millions of dollars to fund their further operations. You're an accomplice at that point. Like, you are part of those criminal activities. Now, our current legal framework isn't interpreting it that way for the most part, but it absolutely should.
But how can you possibly enforce that?
As we saw here, both public companies had to disclose this in their SEC filings. Like, literally, Caesar's like, we paid them to not leak the data. We can't be sure they won't leak the data. But that's where that money went, because they have to account for all the money to their shareholders.
Mm-hmm. In an organization of any real size, you really can't keep a lid on that, especially not if it becomes like outright illegal to pay that ransom. It's one thing if you're talking about, I don't know, like a 10-person architectural firm in, some podunk town somewhere. Maybe you can fly under the radar. But if you're talking about a casino with thousands of employees and systems are like offline because you got ransomwared, I don't think you're going to be able to keep that one under the radar.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like, yeah, casinos and stuff won't be able to pay it. And, airlines and
utility companies and local government offices and, on down the line, man, all the people that can really pay the money.
Yeah, but your small 10-person architecture firms or accountancy firms or whatever, they will pay and get away with it probably.
They're not paying $10 million.
Yeah, they're not the ones who pay $10 million, and they're typically not paying at all. Usually the ones that are paying are like oil and gas industries, casinos, hospitals. It's these really big businesses that have ridiculous amounts of capital to throw around, ultimately. Like if you're in the oil and gas industry, you're generally not running by the skin of your teeth and wondering how you can get your hands on $1 million. I'm not saying that means that, you're making $1 million every day. I'm saying you got the reserves on hand. If you feel like it, you can pay it. And it's not going to be that hard to come up with it. Those are the folks that pay these damn ransoms. They're the ones that are, doing the vast majority of financing, not just the day-to-day operations of like going and trying to infect people, but like, the really big gangs that are doing ransomware as a service kits. Like, where do you think all that money comes from?
But what would you do if a relatively small company came to you and said that we have been subject to a ransomware attack, all our systems are encrypted, all our backups are because we didn't do it right? What do you do in that situation?
What you do in that situation is you are honest with your clients about what happened, and you reconstruct and go forth the best that you can. You report it to law enforcement. You're wide open about it. I mean, you were the victim. Fuck trying to pretend you weren't a victim. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about that. A, you shouldn't have been that vulnerable anyway because all your shit should have been backed up. And I get it. Not everybody has competent IT help. And at this point, you don't, honestly, I don't want to devalue myself or Alan, but you don't need a rock star anymore, man. You just need somebody vaguely competent to set up your backup and disaster recovery and care about it. That's all you really need.
Yeah, but what if you're a company who hasn't done that?
You treat it exactly the same as if there had been a fire and it melted the machines, right?
Yeah.
You have to rebuild.
Or treat it as though a bunch of dudes in like stereotypical black domino masks and freaking watch caps broke in at 3 a.m. and stole all your servers. You don't sit there and dissemble and blah, blah, blah and be like, oh, maybe we can find them. Like we can give them $1 million and they'll give us our servers back. No, you report that shit to the cops and you let your clients know, like, we got some downtime now because our office got broken into.
Yeah, like we're seeing here with companies. A big bookstore here got hit and was just closed for a couple of weeks. And the public library got hit. And it's like, sorry, we can't lend anybody any books for a while until we rebuild all of our computers.
Mm-hmm. And the final piece of that, what do you do, is you learn your damn lesson and you make sure you've got competent IT help, and you make sure that keeping competent IT help is, one of the core responsibilities that's baked directly into your management structure.
Ransomware has been a thing for more than 10 years. If you're not taking steps to protect yourself by now, you put yourself in this situation.
Not only that, ransomware has been a thing for more than a decade. Data loss has been a thing since the very first day there ever was a computer. And the things that you need to do to protect against ransomware are the same things you need to do to protect against any other kind of data loss. And even if ransomware isn't what nails you, if you aren't backing up your stuff and practicing your restores and all the things that Alan and I preach and yell and scream and beg and whine and plead about all the time, the same thing will happen for some other reason. It doesn't have to be a ransomware gang. When your data's gone either way. Now, the bigger thing that I will say is that ransomware, the traditional like, oh no, all my stuff is encrypted, that is easier technologically to deal with than, particularly when we talk about the bigger organizations that frequently pay. The bigger threat in terms of being difficult to defend against is the threat of data exfiltration. That is a whole separate topic, and it is more difficult to keep them from, being able to exfiltrate your data and dump it and embarrass you or blackmail you that way. That is also your responsibility to deal with, and it is still not a good idea to pay the assholes, even if data exfiltration is what you're hoping to avoid. Once they got in, they got in. That part's over with, and you're just going to have to deal with it.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Josh writes, I've heard you guys mention Nagios a few times, and I ran into this project today looking for uses for my Raspberry Pi, and then he links to NEMS Linux. Do you guys have any thoughts or experience with this?
I don't have any experience with it. As far as my thoughts on it, well, it's a Nagios right out of the box distribution, and if what you want is to run Nagios right out of the box on a Raspberry Pi, seems like a good idea to me.
Yeah, it's basically Nagios as an appliance, and they have builds for VMware and EC2 and Docker and the original one for the Raspberry Pi. So yeah, it's basically Nagios as an appliance, which can make a lot of sense. A good way to get started. Although, if you hate Nagios config files, I don't know that you're going to love anything based on Nagios.
It's probably worth reading the first couple lines of marketing fluff on their landing page. Say goodbye to Nagios config files. NEMS Linux is a modern pre-configured, customized, and ready-to-deploy Nagios core image designed to run on low-cost microcomputers. And it goes on from there. I think pre-configured and ready to deploy is a worthwhile brag when we're talking about Nagios. If you are I don't even want to say senior, if you're a veteran system administrator like Alan or myself, it's not that big of a deal to deploy, your first Nagios. It's not going to take you that long to figure it out. I think I probably had it effectively up and running in maybe an hour or so to my first real monitoring, whatever, the first time I used Nagios. Now, I had done a lot of it pretty wrong, and I ended up having to tear most of it out and reorganize it later. And it took me more like a year of active use before I really learned a lot of what I really ought to about how to organize it properly to be able to maintain your configuration and find what you needed in it and add new things in an efficient way. And if you're beginning from a ready to deploy, already installed in Linux system image, I haven't used NEMS, but it seems very reasonable to me to assume that that's going to be a lot more ready to use and discoverable for a new user than starting out just staring at an Ubuntu prompt and saying apt install Nagios.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be similar to the experience a lot of people have using something like OpenSense or a NAS distribution. It provides an easy starting point, and you learn a lot about it. And then if you are so inclined to dig deeper, eventually you might decide to do it yourself without the training wheels. But it provides a way to actually get the work done without having to learn everything first.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or feedback. You can find me at joeres.com/mastodon.
You can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.